Welcome, everyone. This is July 8th, 2026. We, in the week that we missed last week, the diaspora calendar and the Israel calendar matched up. And so now we are together, and we both in the diaspora and in Israel, we have a double portion. So the two portions for this week are Matot and Masai, and they both of them come from the book of Bamidbar, and actually both of the Haftarot come from the book of Jeremiah and the book of Yirmiyahu, and they are consecutive. So let's do a summary of Matot, a summary of Masai very quickly, a summary of the Haftarot of Matot and Masai, and then I want to go into background on the prophet Yirmiyahu, on Jeremiah, and also this period of time that we are in the Hebrew calendar, because it's a very significant period of time we call the 3 weeks. It's not a very creative name, but it is the 3 weeks leading up to the 9th of Ab. We'll talk more about that. Okay, so let's start. We are in the book of Numbers, chapter 30, verse 2 to chapter 32, verse 42. That is Matot. And Matot means tribes. And we find that in the first verse in chapter 30, verse 2, that Moshe is talking to the heads of the tribes and is explaining the process of annulling vows to the heads of the tribes of Israel. There's also a war here against Midian, one of the nations that we keep fighting against, because they are working against us morally, trying to bring moral destruction. If you remember, well, we didn't do last week, but we did talk about Pinchas killing Zimri and Cosby because they were engaged in immorality. Anyway, the Torah gives a detailed account of what are the spoils of war and who do they go to. Then we also have an episode where there are two tribes, the tribe of Reuven and Gad. Reuben, I don't know if there's a translation for God. We spell it in English Gad, who were later joined by half of the tribe of Manasseh. And so the Israelite nation is getting ready soon to cross over into the land of Israel. And these tribes, they want land. They have specifically requested land east of the Jordan to be their portion, because they have a lot of cattle and they want pasture land for their cattle. And initially, Moshe is angered by this request, but he does agree on one condition. And that condition is that when Israel goes to conquer the lands west of the Jordan, what we think of today as Israel proper, that they join in that battle, that they don't just separate themselves from their brothers and their tribesmen, and they are participants, and they do agree to that. Here's a fun fact. My maternal grandfather was named Reuben, and I was named Rivka because it's Reuven in Hebrew, because Reuven and Rivka share two letters in Hebrew. I don't know. That's what my mother always told me. That's why I was named after him. But anyway, okay, so that's the first Torah portion. The second Torah portion must say, it follows immediately after, obviously, chapter 31, verse 1 to chapter 36, verse 13. Masei literally means the journeys of, okay? And there are 42 times that the Israelite nation traveled and then camped from the time that they left Egypt until this point in time, all along the plains of Moab, which is west of Israel. Also, in this parsha, in the parsha of Masai, we learn the boundaries of Israel, what tribes are going to get which portion of the land, and also this concept of Ir Miklat. An Ir Miklat is, in English, a city of refuge. These are places that it's kind of a crazy thing to have a society that has thought about this, but of course it's a godly message, that if somebody inadvertently murders somebody else, they can go to one of these cities of refuge and live there without anybody taking revenge on them until the high priest dies. And so in different places in the country, there were designated these cities of refuge. Iri Miklat. Okay. And then also something that we missed last week, but we did it last year when we talked about the Parsha of Pinchas, which was last year, is the whole story of the daughters of Tzlefchad. And the in this week's Parsha, they agreed to marry within their own tribe, which is the tribe of Manasseh, so that any inheritance that came to them through their father, remember, these are four daughters who have no brothers, and there's nobody else to inherit from their father. And so they inherit land as part of the tribal um, distribution of land. But the concern was, well, when they marry, what's going to happen to their land? So they all agree to marry other people in their tribe so that their tribal land doesn't get lost. That makes sense. That another tribe wouldn't take over that piece of land. That would be kind of messy. Okay, those are the two Torah portions. So remember, what we have is the Israelite nation on the cusp of coming into the land of Israel after 40 years and 42 journeys, Masei, along the way. Okay, now let's look briefly at the Haftarot. Okay, so we're going to start in the book of Yirmiyahu, in the book of Jeremiah, chapter 1, verse 1 to chapter 2, verse 3. That is the Haftarot for Matot. Now, there are three consecutive Haftarot, two this week and one next week, that are referred to as the Haftarot of affliction. They're read during this 3-week period of mourning for Jerusalem between what was last Thursday, the fast of the 17th of Tammuz, and the 9th of Av, which is coming at the end of this month. So Yirmiyahu, Jeremiah, is recounting how God came to appoint him as a prophet. He did not want to accept the task initially. And he talks about the way that God encouraged him to fulfill his mission. And then he describes in this brief Haftarah 2 prophetic images or visions that he had. One, there was an almond tree branch, and that the symbolism of that is that an almond tree blossoms very quickly. And so the message there is that God is going to punish the nation for their sins quickly. Like, it's not going to be a whole drug out, a whole thing that's dragged out. The second vision was a pot that was boiling over, and there was steam or foam that went north. And that was an allusion to how the nation of Israel would suffer from people north of the Holy Land. Specifically, that's a reference to Babylon in biblical times. That God is going to cause, he's warning Jeremiah, God is going to cause the kingdoms north of Israel to attack Jerusalem and Judea. And it's a punishment for the nation because in the time of Jeremiah, they had abandoned God's ways and tinkered with idol worship and so forth. That's not a pleasant message to deliver. It's the job of a lot of the prophets to tell the nation, you've been doing bad. But God does encourage Yirmiyahu to deliver this prophecy and not to be fearful of the people he has to tell this to, because they are for sure not going to accept this with love in their hearts. And the Haftarah ends in a reassuring way with a prophecy to the people. This is from Yirmiyahu chapter 2, verses 2 and 3. Go and call out in the ears of Jerusalem, meaning the people of Jerusalem, saying, this is God talking to them. I remember the loving kindness of your youth, the love of your nuptials, you following me in the desert in a land not sown. Israel is holy to God, the first of his grain. All who eat him shall be guilty, evil shall befall them, says God. So he's saying basically, you did an amazing thing as a nation when you trusted me and you came with me into the desert. Now, in the beginning, it wasn't supposed to take 40 years, but still they were leaving slavery, leaving Egypt, going into this unknown, or in this case, an unsown land. And even though I'm not so happy with you right now, God is saying, I will protect you. You will always be mine. Those who harm you will not do so well. Okay, that's Matot's Haftarah. And Masai follows immediately after that in Yirmiyahu, Jeremiah chapter 2, verses 4 through 28, and then not consecutively, chapter 4, verses 1 and 2. Okay, so this is the second of the series of the three Haftarot of affliction that are read during this period of time. And here, Yirmiyahu is transmitting this message very strongly, chastising everybody, including the leaders, because they have abandoned God. And he's speaking after, like in God's words, he says, this is like, it's Jeremiah saying it, but it's like he's saying what God, it's God's words. What wrong did your forefathers find in me, capital M, meaning God, that they distanced themselves from me and they went after futility and themselves became futile? Okay. So it's like God's feelings are hurt that he gave so much to this nation and they went chasing after idolatry. He reminds them of the kindness, Jeremiah now reminds them of all the kindnesses that God did for them, taking them out of Egypt, the 40 years in the desert, settling them in the land of Israel, and yet they repaid kindness with disloyalty. So I just want you to be clear in your head. The Parsha is before they get into the land of Israel. The Haftarah from Yirmiyahu, they're already there. There's already a first temple, okay? And so they, I guess, have forgotten some of the kindnesses that God did for them when they were a young nation and have fallen once again into idolatry. And so in chapter 2, verse 13 of Jeremiah, he says, this is God again talking through Jeremiah's mouth, for my people have committed two evils. They've forsaken me, the spring of living waters. And further, this was in order to dig for themselves cisterns, broken cisterns that do not hold water. So like, he's basically saying, you guys, I'm the Alpha and Omega, and you're looking for some cheap imitation of me. But I'm paraphrasing what I think God is saying to them. You are wasting your time. That's never going to get you anywhere. I am the one. Um, and God asks them to look at what's going on with the nations around them, in particular, two nations: the Kittites, who were tent dwelling, cattle herding nomads who wandered around, and the Kedarites. Okay, Kedar is the second son of Ishmael. So this is the nation that descended from him, which makes them an Israelite tribe. Okay. Uh, and he further says in chapter 2, verse 11, see whether there ever was, I'm sorry, and see whether there was any such thing, whether a nation exchanged a god, although they are not gods, yet my nation exchanged their glory for what does not avail. So again, it's like I sort of picture God like sighing when he's saying this, right? You had the real deal and you're trading it off. It's like you had a gold coin and you're trading it off for a brass penny, something like that. Yirmiyahu then goes on to prophesy about the suffering that's going to come on the Jewish people at the hands of their enemies, and also the people who seem to be on their side but aren't. So this is chapter 2, verse 19. Your evil will chastise you, and you will be rebuked for your backslidings, and you shall know and see that your forsaking the Lord your God is evil and bitter. This is Jeremiah speaking. So that's part of the harsh words that he's delivering to this nation that it has fallen. And the Haftarah ends, as the other one does, with a little bit of encouragement, assuring the people that if they return to God with sincerity, if they do tshuva, if they turn their hearts back, that they will be restored to their full potential. So it's not too late to get back. That's an eternal message of the prophets, that it's not too late to correct your ways. It's not too late to reconnect with the God of Israel. Okay, so that's the Parshiot and the Haftarah. So where are we? We are approximately 600 years BCE. Yirmiyahu, Jeremiah the prophet, is known as the weeping prophet. He lived roughly from 650 to 570 BCE. What is that? 70 years in the kingdom of Judea. So he lived just south of Jerusalem. He was born in Anatot. Anatot is a city you could actually, I was there once. There used to be an airport, it's in the Jerusalem area. Um, I don't think it's a Jewish area right now, but I definitely remember being there on a tour once. Anyway, he was born to a priestly family. So he was a high status kind of a person. And he was reluctant, as I said before, that when God called him when he was a young boy, um, or that God called him into prophecy, he was not so excited to jump on that train. But he did spend over 40 years warning that imminent destruction of the first temple by the Babylonians was coming. I learned this when I was preparing. I actually didn't know this little known fact that he was born on Tisha B'Av. He was born on the 9th of Av. Now, it wasn't known as Tisha B'Av yet because the destruction of the temple hadn't happened yet. But that's the exact day when the tragedy that he was trying to avoid happened. So, happy birthday to Jeremiah. When it happened, it was his birthday. He lived through the reigns of the last kings of Judea. And we talked, this is what Beth Ann was commenting on, because a lot of these kings have names that start with Y. Yoshiahu, which in English is Josiah, was a king for 30 years. Yehoiakim, I don't know how you say that in English, was a king for 11 years. And then comes Tzidkiyahu, or Zedekiah, who ruled also for 11 years. Zedekiah, Hizkiyahu, was the last king of Yehuda. He was captured and blinded by the Babylonians. His did not end well for him, which are, of course, the people who destroyed the first temple and Jerusalem in approximately 586 BCE. So, interestingly enough, Tzidkiyahu is a chain of Shabbat takeout food stores in Israel. They're called Tzidkiyahu. So I looked it up to see, was there any biblical connection? But they were actually named after the founder, like the guy who opened the first store. If any of you have ever been in the Shuk in Machane Yehuda, right in I don't know what that's called in Jerusalem, the Shuk in Jerusalem. There's a big Tzidkiyahu stand. There's actually a Tzidkiyahu store in the city where I live. So the founder is a guy, his name is Mordechai Tzion Tzidkiyahu, so he just named it after himself. But you can get Shabbat takeout food from Tzidkiyahu, which is so biblical, like the place that you go to get schnitzel and kugel and cucumber salad for Shabbat is named after, well, the founder, but actually the last king of Judea. Okay. So in the time that he was alive and in the time that Yirmiyahu was doing his prophecy thing, there was a lot of moral decline, a lot of social injustices, and as we spoke about, widespread idolatry. He's coming along saying, the sky is falling, catastrophe is coming. And his advice was that you should submit to the Babylonians, and that will spare Jerusalem. He did not have an easy message to deliver, and it was not well received. He was heavily persecuted there were false prophets in his day who were telling the people the exact opposite of what he was saying, like reassuring them that they're fine and nothing bad is going to happen. The priests, government officials, everybody was against Yirmiyahu. In his lifetime, he was beaten, he was imprisoned, he was subject to public ridicule. No wonder he's called the weeping prophet. Not only does he have this terrible, terrible message to give to the nation, but most people don't believe him. Interestingly enough, so on Tisha B'Av, it's not like Yom Kippur in the sense that we can drive and we can use the computer and stuff like that. And so I have historically spent most of Tisha B'Av, watching films, documentaries or whatever about this period of time. And it's not a Jewish film, actually, but there is a film called Jeremiah. It's about an hour and a half long, and you can watch it and get a sense. Maybe some of you have seen it. I can send a link if anybody's interested, just let me know. That sort of gives you a visual for what his life was like. Okay, what were his main messages? What were his main prophecies? So the first, of course, was to get people to recognize that they were engaged in idol worship, that they had deserted God and his Torah. not only the people, but the priests and the false prophets of Israel, that there was terrible social injustice at the time. And oh, Jan's seen the movie. Okay. Yeah, I highly recommend it, even though it's not specifically a Jewish movie. And when I watch it again, maybe I'll see, oh, that's not really accurate. But in general, I felt like it captured his time period. Anyway, there was also sexual immorality going on. So the whole nation in his time is not so healthy. Okay. So he's the prophet who delivers the final warning to the people that this imminent national catastrophe, the destruction of the first temple, and the city of Jerusalem, the city of Jerusalem, is coming. Okay, so that's his job. It's not a fun job. What can we learn from Yirmiyahu? Okay, in some people say he's one of the most relatable prophets because his life is less about predicting the future. He has this one thing, that if you don't straighten up and fly right, the temple's going to be destroyed. You're going to lose Jerusalem. But it's more about the cost of remaining faithful to the truth when no one wants to hear it. So rather than focusing primarily on prophecies of doom, his story is kind of the story of someone who has chosen to broadcast his truth in the world over, certainly over being popular. Okay. So, um, so we start at the very beginning of his life in chapter 1, verse 5, where God is saying to him, before I formed you in the womb, I knew you. And Yirmiyahu immediately objects and he says, I do not know how to speak. I am only a youth. Okay. So the very beginning, we learn that God doesn't necessarily call people who are like the high and mighty. He's calling an ordinary Jewish boy, that you may assume that God only uses gifted or confident people. But Yirmiyahu is teaching us actually the opposite, that throughout Tanakh, God sometimes chooses reluctant people in a sense because they're not so full of themselves. Like they are more faithful, they rely or depend more on God rather than on what they have accomplished or um, the power that they have acquired. So the first thing we can learn from Yirmiyahu is this idea that God often calls on ordinary people. If you have ever felt in your life, as I have in mine, in terms of the work that we do together, like why in the world did God pick me? You know, Jan says like King David. Yeah, he was a simple shepherd, and he was not exactly beloved by anybody except his mother in the beginning of his life. And he rises to become the great king of Israel and the predecessor of the messianic figure. But let's just speak much more humbly, like about me. When this was evolving in my world, this idea that I had something to share with people who were outside of the Jewish world, I I did not really understand, like, why did God pick me? I'm not um I don't have an institution, I don't have an organization. I have certain I'm not being overly humble. I don't suffer from low self-esteem. But also, like, I wasn't raised in a religious home, and there's lots of things that I don't know that like ordinary religious Jews know. And so it's kind of a question, not a question, because I understand this principle. So I would ask you to think about, maybe there's something you've been called to. You wonder, like, why I feel like God is calling me, but like, why is he calling me? Who the heck am I? I remember when my husband and I first got married, and now all of a sudden, I'm not just Rivka, but now I'm like Rebbitzin, Rabbi's wife, Rivka. And all of a sudden, people were taking me much more seriously. And all I did was stand under a chuppah for 20 minutes. But like, I wasn't fundamentally different. But anyway, okay. What's another lesson we can learn from Yirmiyahu is this idea that speaking truth can be a lonely thing. That Yirmiyahu spent 40 years, 4 decades, warning Judea that its moral corruption is going to lead to destruction, and almost nobody listened to him. I told you, he was mocked, he was beaten, he was imprisoned, he was accused of treason, he was thrown into a muddy pit, he was ignored by political leaders, but he never abandoned his mission. And the idea here modern culture often measures success by influence, popularity, or followers, especially in the case of social media. And Yirmiyahu is reminding us that God's measure is simple faithfulness. I I think that I just thought of something else. I've been following this woman. She's actually a Christian woman. She's probably late 30s, early 40s, something like that. And she and her husband are on this mission they have a lot, they're Americans and they have a lot of debt. And she's been documenting their journey to reduce their debt from like over $150,000 to zero in a year. That was their goal. And so she would come on with, these updates. And one of the things they did was that they sold their big fancy car and they bought a more humble car. And she talked about how she felt when they got this expensive up, upscale car or whatever, that she was proving something through some status through owning this vehicle. And she realized that what she really needs for herself and her family is just a reliable vehicle. It doesn't have to be like a Mercedes, or it wasn't. It doesn't have to be like some big fancy car. And I think that lesson is the same here. That she's separating herself from the culture around her, um, what they value or what they purport to value, as opposed to what is the true value. I hope that analogy plays for you. I'm not sure if it does. But one question to ask yourself here is, would you still tell the truth if everyone in your life rejected you? Now, for those of you who are here with me learning, who have either Christian or maybe non-religious people in your lives who do not understand your personal connection to Torah, this is really more than a theoretical question. How do you stay true to what you think God is saying to you when people around you are telling you otherwise? Okay, so that's another lesson from Yirmiyahu. The third one is that love sometimes requires hard words. So a lot of people, maybe who have a surface level of understanding the books of prophets, is that prophets just were constantly condemning people and telling them what they're doing wrong. But Yirmiyahu was different in that he really loved his nation and he wept over what he saw coming. That we talked about, that he has the nickname, the weeping prophet, that his warnings didn't come from anger, they came from compassion for his people. And that's the lesson for us, is that real love comes with warnings. If you really love somebody and you see that something's going wrong, you will open your mouth and say something, not to some stranger on the street, but to somebody you really care about. Parents warn their children, doctors warn their patients, good friends warn one another if they see that the other person is going off in a direction that is ultimately harmful for them. That comes from love. Silence isn't always kindness. Sometimes silence is a measure of indifference. If you don't care, you have no relationship with a person who's doing stuff that they ought not be doing, then you don't need to open your mouth. But when you open your mouth, it's because you care about somebody. Another lesson, and we've seen this one before, is this idea that God values justice over religious appearance, more than religious appearance. So Yirmiyahu himself, he came from a priestly class, and he regularly attacked religious hypocrisy. The people of that time often believed that, well, they have the temple and therefore God is going to protect them. And Yirmiyahu's response to them was, not if you oppress the poor, not if you steal, not if you exploit the widow and the orphan, not if you if your worship is empty. This is one of the themes of Tanakh that we see over and over again. It is not enough to go through the rituals. You have to have an ethical lifestyle. God wants integrity more than rituals that are just performed like without integrity, just by rote. And this, I think this can resonate with anybody, that this idea, but further in terms of our work, that this lesson from this Jewish prophet is an answer to those people from the Christian world who claim that Jews blindly follow ritual over having a relationship with God. Because Jeremiah told us in the Hebrew scripture, that's not good enough. It's not good enough to go and do your empty sacrifices in the temple in Jerusalem if you are also exploiting the widow, or you're also stealing from people, or you're also whatever the other bad things are that you're doing. Okay. Another lesson is that nations rise and fall based on morality. So Yirmiyahu's trying to explain that the destruction of Jerusalem is not because Babylon is a stronger army, but because Judah, the Jews, have abandoned what God has asked of them. Political strength can't overcome moral collapse. So civilizations are sustained by character as much as by military power or economic power or whatever. Any civilization that has a rotting moral core will eventually fold. And we see that over and over and over again in history and in news. Okay, lesson number 6 from Yirmiyahu. Yirmiyahu is teaching us that there is judgment, and then there is reason to be hopeful. Although he lived in the time of the destruction of the first temple, and he is associated with not that he did it, but like, with prophesying about the destruction of the coming for destruction of the first temple, he also delivered some of the best promises, or the greatest promises in all of Tanakh, because he's mentioning that after 70 years of exile, God is going to, in other words, after the destruction of the first temple, the Jews are in exile for 70 years, but he's promising beyond that, at the end of that 70-year period, that God is going to gather his people again. He's going to rebuild the land. People will be happy again. The covenant will remain intact. The future promises were never canceled, even though you have to go through this painful time. It's a little bit like this. I don't mean to diminish this, but it's a little bit like if you have to have surgery, let's say, like I am considering doing another knee replacement surgery. Okay, I did one in 2017. The process itself is brutal, and the recovery is not fun at all. But I know that after that, like after the healing, comes good things. So it's a little bit like that, in that he's saying, yes, we're going to destroy the temple. Yes, the Babylonians are going to destroy Jerusalem. Yes, you are going to be exiled. But after you like pay your penalty, good things are going to come to you. Hope follows judgment. It's going to be bad for a while, but that doesn't mean it's going to be bad forever and ever. And that follows along with this next lesson, number 7, is that God never abandons his covenant, because Jeremiah actually compares Israel to creation itself. This is in chapter 31, where he teaches that about the fixed order of the sun, the moon, the stars, that if that would ever go away, then that's when God would reject Israel. In other words, God's promises are dependable. His faithfulness doesn't depend on human perfection. God's character is consistent, and as consistent as the sun and the moon and the stars. So just like their fixed order will never disappear from the world, God will never ultimately reject Israel. I have a few more lessons from this, is that one righteous person can preserve hope for the whole nation. Yirmiyahu often said what he said by himself. Kings ignored him, priests opposed him, false prophets contradicted him, but history proved him right. And so we never want to underestimate the influence of one individual who was faithful to God. The many important changes that we have seen historically begin with one person who refuses to compromise. So that's the role of Yirmiyahu. Also, just because a person suffers, this is the 9th lesson, doesn't mean that God has abandoned you, because Yirmiyahu endured extraordinary suffering over a long period of time. He cried, he lamented, he suffered, he had a very hard life, but he continued speaking with God and for God. And so, sort of a lesson in spiritual health is that faith doesn't require us to pretend that everything is fine. You're allowed to grieve while you have a relationship with God. Hashem doesn't say, if you really believed in me, you wouldn't feel sad. You wouldn't feel grief. You wouldn't feel suffering. That's not true. The idea here, the lesson here, and I think it's a strong one, is that going through hard things, it doesn't mean that God's abandoned you. It doesn't mean you have to abandon Hashem, because putting those two things together is a source of tremendous spiritual growth. I am in pain because I'm human, and also I have a relationship with Hashem. And we learn that also from Yirmiyahu, from Jeremiah. Um, okay, another, maybe is this the last one of this category? I think so. Yeah. Okay. So hope itself is an act of faith, especially in hard times. One of Yirmiyahu's most remarkable actions occurred while Jerusalem was under siege, and God instructed him to buy a field. Now, we talked about this during the Haftarot, I don't know, 3 weeks or so ago, but I'll just remind you. From a human perspective, the idea of investing in a field in Jerusalem when Jerusalem's about to be destroyed is absurd. The city is about to fall. But he buys the land because he's declaring publicly that one day families are going to come back to this land. They're going to again buy vineyards. They are going to again plant fields and build homes in Israel. So in the Haftarah for Bahar is this exact passage that that talks about the king at the time, the king Tzidkiyahu, Zedekiah. He's like basically imprisoned in the royal compound because he's saying these things about how Jerusalem's going to be destroyed, the temple's going to be destroyed, the people are going to be exiled. And that's where God came to him and said that his cousin's going to come to him and he's going to offer Jeremiah the chance to buy his ancestral family land. Excuse me. And God instructs Yirmiyahu to accept the offer, to actually go through with the purchase. And that's what happens. His cousin, excuse me. Okay. Sorry. His cousin comes to the compound where he's being contained. He makes an offer and Yirmiyahu accepts. Money's transferred. There's a document of purchase that is created in the presence of witnesses. And then the prophet Yirmiyahu gives the deed to this land to his disciple for safekeeping, to store it someplace where it's going to remain for many, many years. And then Yirmiyahu says what God tells him to say. So says the Lord of hosts, the God of Israel, houses and fields and vineyards shall be purchased again in this land. That's the message of hope, even on the eve of destruction, the eve of exile. Yes, the Jews are going to be exiled, but they will eventually be returned to their land. So sometimes acting from faith means acting today according to the future that God's promised rather than the circumstances that we currently see. So what would be an example of that? I can give you a Jewish example of that, is that some people will say, this war with Iran, which is, and its proxies, we just passed a few days ago, like 1,000 days. Maybe you heard about this in the news. And Israel goes in and out of high alert. And so we are involved on 7 fronts. Some say 8 fronts because the 8th front is like the social media war. And sometimes the country goes in high alert. Sometimes people have to go rush to their safe rooms, blah, blah, blah. All that stuff is going on. And at the same time, people are moving here. Jews are coming home because they understand that the future, that like it might not be ideal right now, but the future that God has promised, that is the redemptive, the geula, the redemption, is more important to connect to and act on than the circumstances that we currently are living through. Okay, so just summarizing some of the themes that we see in this book: integrity over popularity, justice for the vulnerable. He doesn't just say idolatry. He's saying you're also mistreating the orphans and the widows, and you're also stealing from people, and you are also mistreating a lot of people. Having hope after failure, faith during suffering, the moral responsibility of leaders. Because remember, Yirmiyahu, who came from this priestly family, is speaking kind of to his peers and saying, you are failing as leaders of this nation. He's also speaking difficult truth with compassion, and he's trusting that Hashem has a long-term plan here. Okay, so he's teaching us that faithfulness is not measured by how many people agree with us, but by whether we are saying what we believe God is intending, even when it's difficult, even in the face of people who are not buying what we're selling. That it's also showing, Yirmiyahu's also showing that what God really cares about is justice. And that when you genuinely love somebody, you sometimes have to share uncomfortable truths. And also that even after judgment, that really the ultimate is restoration. Not he doesn't mean to turn people into despair, like, oh my God, this is so bad and life is never going to be normal again. And so he's reminding us that the faithfulness of one person, the connection that one person has, we've got, okay, he was a prophet, God spoke to him. That's not usually happening to people to us, but that person can become a light for future generations, even though he didn't live to see the end of the exile. Okay, now I want to so that's a lot about Yirmiyahu and his prophecies and what we learn from him and so forth. I want to transition into this period of the 3 weeks, this sort of 3-week long annual mourning period that goes from the 17th of Tammuz, which again was last week, Wednesday night, Thursday, to the 9th of Av, which we call Tisha B'Av, which falls this year on July 22nd and 23rd. And it commemorates the breaching of the walls of Jerusalem and the destruction of the first temple, and also the second temple, and a whole bunch of other things. Spiritually, it's an opportunity for personal reflection, introspection, and also for yearning for Geula, yearning for redemption. Rather than just being a historical time period, like, oh, now we're supposed to remember the second temple. In Hebrew, this period of time is called Ben HaMetzarim, which means between the straits. And there's some spiritual significance to it that I want to share with you. One is that we mourn the palpable presence of the divine, because when the Holy Temple stood, there was a connection between the divine presence and this lower world. And that presence was ruptured when the temple was destroyed. So there's a kind of grief over that. Obviously, imagine if you lived in the time of the first temple or even the second temple. But right now we're talking about Yirmiyahu in the first temple period. And you could go to Jerusalem and you could plug into some high spiritual energy by going to the temple. And now the temple's gone and you can never plug into that channel again. Okay. So some of the practices that Jews have during these 21 days are meant to internalize. They parallel what we do during Shiva, during the 7 days after somebody in our family has passed away. And they're meant to help us internalize the idea that we really lost something. Even though I'm sitting here, I'm just a few kilometers from Jerusalem, but my nation is still in exile. We still don't have a temple. We don't have this divine presence. What we have is a divine absence. Also, spiritually, the sages teach that the destruction of the temples came from baseless hatred and communal division. And so these weeks serve as an opportunity for us to self-reflect and to heal things in our society, in our relationships, rebuild things that are broken. Which is also one of the themes of Elul, which happens the month before Rosh Hashanah, but specifically about the relationship, the division between communities, and the divisions between people, and things that we hate one another for, that divide us. Also, in the Hasidic world, there's a tradition that if you actively study the design of the Holy Temple and the function of it, that and in that way, it helps make it more concrete. It helps metaphorically participate in its rebuilding. One of the things, I don't know how this works exactly, but one of the things that I saw that my children were taught and my grandchildren are being taught is that when they do something good, they are creating a brick to help rebuild the temple. I don't think it means it literally. Obviously, it doesn't mean it literally like literal bricks, but it's a very lovely idea that um, when you do something correctly, you um, you are somehow participating in the spiritual preparation for the third temple. So this period of time is a mourning period and it is a grieving period, but it's also a time to actively prepare for the coming of Geula, the coming of the Messianic era, when sorrow gets transformed into more positive things. On Tisha B'Av itself, on the 9th of Av itself, we read from the book of Eicha, the book of Lamentations, which talks about the destruction of the first temple in the city of Jerusalem by the Babylonians in 586 BCE. And traditionally, the book is attributed to the hand of Jeremiah, but the book itself doesn't name the author. But there's a really interesting notion that some people I have known every year after they read, it's a public reading. So somebody reads it and other people have the text in front of them and follow along. And that they like not burn the book because it's a book of Torah, but they bury the book every year because they say, okay, that's it. We've done it. Like next year, we won't need to do this anymore because the third temple will be with us. It's I think it's a symbolic act, but it's a lovely one. Okay. And the last thing I want to talk about is a little bit about the temple. And I have to tell you this. So over the last couple of weeks, we've been meeting with a lot of old friends. And I met with an old friend, I don't want to say too much because of what I'm going to say, but a very, very serious Reform Jew. Okay. And like in my world, and even when I'm talking to you guys, when I talk about the third temple and anticipating the third temple, I think it's real for you, like it's real for me, and it's real for people in my world. And I said something about it at this meal, and she rolled her eyes and said, oh, I'm paraphrasing, like, oh, with the animal sacrifice, I just can't. Now, I know that the Reform movement in general, this is the liberal American Jewish movement, they have in their theology excised all mentions of the third temple in their prayer. And that's actually why, maybe I've taught you this before, that Reform synagogues often have the name temple in their name. Temple Beth Am, Temple Har Sinai, Temple Emmanuel, whatever the name is, because they think that their houses of worship replace the Holy Temple. And so they don't believe that in a third temple. And it was so interesting to me. I mean, I didn't pursue it with her because she taught me Torah when I knew nothing. But I thought, wow, what a disconnect. I don't know what she does with Tisha B'Av. I don't know if the Reform movement actually even acknowledges Tisha B'Av now that I think about it, because mourning the loss of the first two temples is maybe not something they're interested in. It is primarily a Jewish concern, and the 3 weeks are a period of national mourning. But I think there is a more universal question that I would present to you, and that is what happens to a society when it loses its moral and spiritual center, which is what the temple was. The 3 weeks every year, a reminder that a civilization can collapse, not because necessarily they were overtaken militarily, but because of internal rot and decay. That's what I talked about. That's what the message of Jeremiah wasn't, oh, the big bad Babylonians are going to come and destroy you. You are rotting from within. So it's not like they're just going to go and you're going to fall. I mean, obviously there was a battle, there was a war, but it would not have been possible if the Jewish nation hadn't had this internal decay. So it's a moral tragedy, not more than it is a military tragedy. Okay, um, the prophets are repeatedly insisting that the temple wasn't destroyed by the first temple by Babylon, the second temple by Rome, because they were stronger, but because Israel didn't live up to its covenant with God. And we see that in Yirmiyahu, in Jeremiah, in Yeshayahu, in Isaiah, in Yecheskel, in Ezekiel. Them and all the other prophets make that same point. The temple represented God's presence among humanity. It wasn't just like an ancient synagogue. It was a place that God chose to put his presence. So my husband just walked into the room, to dwell among the people. So it symbolized the closeness of God, the holiness, justice, forgiveness, prayer, unity, this physical meeting place between heaven and earth. And it reminded Israel that life was meant to be lived around godliness. And that's something that we lost. That's something that we're mourning. Now it's much harder. It's not impossible, but it's much harder to live because we don't have a tangible symbol of that connection. There's also this idea that God doesn't protect buildings that have lost their purpose. So this is one of Jeremiah's greatest messages, because the people said, "Oh, well, we have the temple, so nothing bad's going to happen to us." And Yirmiyahu said to them, as we talked about before, "Yeah, you are putting your faith in a stone temple, and you think that that gives you like permission or the ability to oppress the weak and exploit others, and if your worship is empty ritual. The temple is not like um, some magical protection. It existed in order to inspire people to live holy lives." And so again, we come to this lesson that religious symbols or ritual are not substitutes for the righteousness of the behavior. I'm trying to skip ahead because I see we're running out of time and I don't have time to do everything else. So let me just end with this. And that is this idea that the temple belonged to the nations as well. One of the beautiful ideas from Tanakh is that the temple was never intended only for Israel. When Shlomo HaMelech, when King Solomon dedicated the first temple, you'll find this in Malachi Malach, 1 Kings, chapter 8, verses 41 to 43. He's dedicating the first temple. And what is his prayer? That the prayers of the foreigners who came to Jerusalem to see God would be answered. And Yeshayahu, Isaiah, also has a similar prophecy when he says, my house should be called a house of prayer for all nations. That's Isaiah 55, chapter 56, verse 7. So the ultimate purpose of the temple was universal. Israel was entrusted with it, but its blessings were meant to reach the whole world. And I'll just end with this idea that God's intention, his desire, has always been to bless all the nations through his, meaning God's, relationship with Israel. So you guys are part of the story, and you should be praying on Tisha B'Av or during this 3-week period or anytime as much for the restoration of the third temple as I do and other Jews do, because it's for you too. I mean, you're here studying with a Jewish woman. Obviously, you're on board with this relationship, but this is the correct alignment. Is that we are entrusted with this mission, but with the intention that it reflects out. That's what Or LaGoyim, that's what a light to the nations means. Not to keep it all to ourselves, but to shepherd the rest of the people, the rest of the world into this godly life. Okay, I think that's a very good place to end. So that is Matot-Masei, and a little bit about the time period that we're in. So for those of you that are in our community, I'm going to end this recording now and encourage you to check back in, and we will have our private discussion time. So thank you for being with me, and I'll see the rest of you very soon.